Hey everyone, welcome back to Glassratner's Business Interruption webinar series. Today we're going to talk real briefly about extra expenses. There's a lot of coverage questions surrounding a lot of business interruption claims. However, the first step in an extra expense claim is going to be able for you to keep track of what those expenses may be. So we'll put a list together of some of the potential extra expenses. Now keep in mind this doesn't necessarily mean that these extra expenses would be covered. But in order to present the claim, you at least need to keep track of what those extra expenses may be in order to present to the insurance carrier for your business interruption and extra expense claim. So one thing to keep in mind here is that a typical policy will require that an extra expense must serve to reduce a business interruption loss. So to the extent that there's a coverage question, which in many cases, because of coronavirus, that may be the case, then it's going to be important to keep track of these because a lot of these issues are not going to be settled right off the bat. It's going to take some time to actually get into some sort of negotiation with your carrier. So to the extent that you can actually document them, you're going to be more prepared in order to present that claim later on. So if you're keeping track of these things as you go, maybe you have them identified to a specific new account on your profit and loss statement, it's going to be easier for you somewhere down the line in order to keep track of some of those extra expenses. That's not to say that everything is going to be covered. That's not what we're doing here. What we're really trying to accomplish here is just to make sure that we're keeping track of some of those extra expenses for the claim down the line. So again, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to give you a few examples of potential extra expenses that I think you should keep track of. Now, not to say that these would be covered extra expenses. However, these are the things that I would necessarily keep track of in order to present a claim to my insurer. And those things may include some of the additional costs to equip some of your remote workers, or some of the hazard pay that I might be paying some of my employees, the hero pay that you keep hearing about in the media, those sorts of things. I would definitely try and keep track of those separately. What you're really looking to understand is what the excess payroll was over and above normal in that circumstance. And so you may get into an argument with insurance carriers about whether something may be excess over normal. And then the other thing that typically is looked at in some of these situations is whether those employees are salaried versus hourly workers. So particularly if you have hourly workers that you're paying more overtime than normal, or you're just paying more, you have more workers than normal, then that's going to be important to understand, and that's something that a claim preparer can really help out with. You may also be looking for any fees, finder fees, or referral fees in order to equip some of those additional workers that you may have. To the extent that you took out PPP, keep track of whatever your interest costs, or maybe some of the loan origination fees, some of those loan costs may be. To the extent that a restaurant, for instance, may be using additional packaging as a result of the loss of their dining room, I'd keep track of some of those expenses. A lot of that may be a normal cost, but again, you're trying to squeeze out what the extra cost over and above your normal packaging cost would be. If you have additional reopening costs, that'd be important to understand. And then also in the case of possibly maybe some healthcare where you have to secure and monitor visitors where you did not normally have to do that, keep track of some of those expenses. I've seen that in the context of some ALS, as additional assisted living facilities, and to where the visitors have to be, it's a lot more tightly controlled as a result of people bringing in some of the potentially some of the virus. If you have additional signage, possibly for directing people around your facilities, that's important to understand. And again, we get into some more of the staffing costs. If you have commissioned surveys, so say for instance you have a hygienic survey done to know what your risks are, then keep track of what some of those costs may be. Or if there's other sort of environmental surveys. So anything that could be identified specifically to some of the actual, identifying some of the risks, and particularly if you're trying to have some of those cleanup costs, that's important to understand. Some people have gone out to upgrade, or not even necessarily upgrade, but basically put in contactless equipment in the way of faucets and other devices that limit people's ability to or need to touch certain surfaces, so that limited their exposure. That's important to keep track of that. I will say that one of the things that would be important to also keep track of in that case would be to make sure that you keep existing capital expenditures and what your budgets may have been both before and after the coronavirus outbreak. You'd want to know what that looked like prior to the outbreak, and then also how it was impacted by the break itself. We'd also like to know to the extent that you actually have to pay any additional permits or licenses. So say, for instance, you have a restaurant, and I think in many cases, a lot of cities and counties are kind of waiving some of these fees, but to the extent you do have to pay for permits to maybe extend your seating onto sidewalks, things like that, that'd be important to understand as well. The cost to actually install barriers. So you see this in a lot of places, particularly where businesses have stepped in and added plexiglass barriers for the protection of cashiers, that sort of thing. You want to know what some of those costs may be. To the extent you have to outfit temporary offices, or maybe even extend curbside service, and you have some of those costs, and be important to keep track of those. And then also, obviously, some of the direct costs of testing workers or testing customers, to the extent that you have some of those, it'd be important to identify that. I would take that and specifically stick it in a separate expense account on the balance sheet, or not on the balance sheet, but on the income statement. If you have COVID-related advertising costs, that's also important to keep track of. So say that in a traditional sense, you would also have maybe additional fuel costs. Now that'd be a little bit more, may not necessarily be coronavirus specific. That may be more related to like a normal situation where you'd see like hurricane damage, and then you're trying to fuel up generators to keep the lights on. That's important to keep track of in a normal sense. And since hurricane season is upon us, that's be important. I just decided to throw that one in there as well. You have increased rental equipment costs. Keep track of that. And then also the big one would be the personal protective equipment, PPE. So masks, gloves, sanitizer, cleaning supplies. Keep track of some of those. Again, I'd stick that in its own separate line item on the profit and loss statement. That's important to keep track of. Any additional teleconferencing costs. This is obviously not a comprehensive list, but I think it kind of hits some of the highlights. And so again, what we're really trying to do is want to give you the tools to be able to identify what some of these expenses would be, and to be able to keep track of some of these expenses. You'd want to know, obviously, how they are identified specifically to the covered loss. And again, this is really just to give you the benefit of some of the tools, and be able to keep track of it for an extra expense claim down the line. So again, I hope this is a helpful exercise just to give you an idea about what a potential extra expense claim may look like. And again, your job as a business owner is really to identify some of those costs, and then give yourself the tools to be able to kind of keep track of some of those expenses, so that later on, if you do decide to put in an extra expense claim, you have those already pulled together and ready to go. Again, you're getting into, to the extent there's actual coverage, questions. The one requirement in a typical scenario is that an extra expense would serve to reduce a BI loss. So if your insurance company is basically saying that you don't have a BI loss, it obviously is not going to save anything towards a BI loss of 0. But again, that is a little bit of the negotiation that is set to go. It's set to unfold as things move on. We get a little further away from the outbreak and everything. So hope this was helpful, and hope to see you back next week for another edition of GlassRatner's Business Interruption webinar. Thanks.